Hello again. We're in John Wesley Bready, page 59 of this Freedom Whence, in his chapter 4, Politics, Penal Code and Prisons. He's talking about England under Walpole. Under Walpole, England was waxing fat, but this fatness betokened moral disease. True, during his long administration, all absolutism on the part of the sovereign was broken, and parliamentary government by a prime minister and cabinet responsible to the legislature was being evolved. But it is equally true that systematic corruption was rapidly making the House of Commons a non-representative body, and that the arrogant, acquisitive, quarrelsome Whig oligarchy, which for half a century dominated English politics, was, at the termination of Walpole's rule, putrid to the bone. Besides certain titles and honors, Walpole, during his tenure of power, bestowed upon his own sons permanent offices, chiefly sinecures, totaling about £15,000 a year. And foreseeing his own downfall, he procured for himself not only the title Earl of Orford, but also a pension of £4,000 a year, the equivalent of some £10,000 today, and dare say something more like £200,000 or £300,000 in modern money. The great Whig families who supported him accordingly expected and got proportionate rewards, while meantime there was growing up that nauseating brood of political jobbing attorneys who rode the country and bought and sold seats openly, thus heralding the day when venal boroughs were publicly advertised for sale in the newspapers, and when the scandals of a great county election made it cost as much as £100,000. With a lawyer's love of a case, Mr. J.W. Judwine, the barrister historian, holding a brief for George III as a great constitutional monarch, tries to establish the double thesis: one, that George and his only strong ministers were non-party men who sought unswervingly the common good, and two, that the Whig oligarchy, or confederation of family clans, which they dislodged, had gorged itself with political spoil and was rancid with internal corruption. That Judwine fails to establish the first part of this thesis is not surprising. To argue that George III, Bute, North, and the younger Pitt were not Tories but non-party men, seeking disinterestedly the nation's good, is to fly in the face of a volume of irrefutable evidence. It savors too much of case pleading and legal casuistry to carry conviction, even though some of these men have been unjustly maligned by Whig historians. Certainly it is well to remember that in 1768, Benjamin Franklin, then a resident in England, writing from London when the turmoil of the Wilkes riots was at its height, said, quote, what the event will be, God only knows, but some punishment seems preparing for a people who are ungratefully abusing the best constitution and the best king any nation was ever blessed with. End of Franklin quote. Certainly, too, it is wise always to bear in mind that the turn of events associated with the American Revolutionary War has caused popular historians to paint the characters of Bute, North, and George III in colors unreasonably somber. Such facts, nevertheless, do not establish the contention that George III and his strong ministers were non-party men, actuated only by the highest national ideals. They all were Tories, and for the realization of their schemes they played Tory politics and depended on Tory support. They labored, however, in an atmosphere which gradually was being impregnated with new spiritual life, and wherein higher ideals of public service were slowly being evolved. But if Mr. Judwine fails to establish the first part of his thesis, the second he proves to the hilt. For the historical evidence establishing the rottenness of the Whig clans, which for 2 generations manipulated and corrupted English politics, is overwhelming. Even Horace Walpole, that vain, gossiping man of affairs, who lived smugly on sinecures left him by his father, complains, despite his Whig prejudices, of the growing danger from aristocracy and from those confederacies of great lords. In 1770, for instance, he writes, of the Whigs, the various factions hated each other more than they did their common enemies, and most of the leaders of the opposition had in their time contributed to the grievances of which they complain. Again, of the proud aristocracy of Whig lords, he says, they thought of nothing but establishing their own power, and, as it suited their occasional purposes, now depressed and insulted the crown and the royal family, and now raised the prerogative. Put a link into the contrast of all of this. Well, while all of this is happening at the highest levels of England, there is a stirring going on that's hinted at here. Something's changing, and it's for the good, and one of the chief roles in that transformation of England in the next 50 years would be William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce series that Vivian has done, and I think it's run to about 10 videos, so I'll put the link into the first of those.